Right, thanks Patrick for the kind words and for the invitation to speak here tonight, and thank you all for coming. It's a great pleasure to be here. We're going to talk about AI. Before we start, just a little bit about myself. Patrick has actually already told you quite a lot, but I was trained originally in Utrecht, then worked in Amsterdam after getting my PhD. And then indeed, 10 years ago, moved to Manchester and very recently to Cambridge, where I work at the Healthcare Improvement Studies Institute. My background is in computer science and AI. I would describe the field that I work in as health informatics and data science. My own research is about electronic health records, healthcare quality and safety, computerized clinical decision support, and clinical prediction models. I've worked across many different clinical areas. I've listed a couple here on the slide. Anesthesiology is not one of them, I must admit. So I won't be able to tell you much specifically about the use of AI in anesthesiology. It's a general talk about the use of AI in medicine and healthcare. Although I have found there's a discussion about the use of AI in anesthesiology, and we're going to come back to that later. So Manchester is the place where it all started, with the Manchester baby, as it is often called, the SSEM computer, the first computer that was built, and was built in 1948. And it was very big, as you can see from the picture. So what we see here is a replica that you can still see at the Museum of Science and Industry in Manchester. So it filled a room really, and it could hardly do 1,000 or 1 million or so of what your smartphone that you have in your pocket can do. So that's how quick things have changed. So 76 years ago now, and here we are. So these are this relates to trends that we have seen over the 75 years, which are very persistent and will continue in the decades to come for sure. So the first is that computers increasingly become smaller. The second is that increasingly they are everywhere. So we have them now in our pockets. In the future, there's even going to be more computers, and they're going to be even more everywhere. They're increasingly connected to each other, typically via the internet. Then also, increasingly we give more control to computers. Computers tend to become more oriented towards us and the way we think and the way our bodies are shaped. And finally, computers can increasingly perform complex tasks. And that's the topic of today, so artificial intelligence. And just to take the temperature of the room, I'm going to ask you a question. And it's about ChatGPT, which I'm sure you've heard of. And I've got a statement. In 5 years' time, ChatGPT will perform online consultations in the NHS, effectively replacing clinicians. And you can use either the QR code or go to slide.do and then enter that code. And tell me whether you agree or disagree with that statement. Okay, very interesting. So we've got a clear majority saying no, that is not going to happen. But there's a substantial minority, I would say, who does believe that it will happen. And then we have also some people who say, I don't know. I probably belong to that group, to be honest. Could I just ask, so starting with no, is there anyone who said no and wants to tell me why they believe this is not going to happen?
even I don't know why half the patients I see in my clinic are there. in reality. Either they're there because someone's clicked something in error, or a surgeon has gone, oh, you need to see an anaesthetist because you're high risk and you're not. Most of the patients I see in clinic just need a good chat about that they are high risk and what that means, and generally they've already been told by the surgeon they'll die if they don't have the operation, so it doesn't matter anyway. There's a small minority who are the reason that I do a clinic that don't know they're there to begin with, but do after I have spoken to them. And that is why I don't think that with the data available, you would know why they were there in the first place, never mind to come to a conclusion.
Right.
My opening line is, do you know why you've been sent to see me? And usually that is so that I can find out some information.
Yeah. So you feel this is something that computers would never be able to do?
Because the NHS is not organised enough to give the computer enough data to come to a reasonable conclusion.
Okay, thanks. Let's go to someone who said yes. Over there.
So, completely mirroring my colleague's comments, that's exactly why I will do online consultations. Because most people who turn up online are there, I don't know what's wrong with them. And also the mistake is the majority of consultations done with GPs. If you speak to a GP, most of them are largely a waste of GP's time. So I'm not suggesting that. I think the consultation could be used, certainly with ChatGPT or whatever it evolves in 5 years, to act as a very effective filter. You know, that's what it's about really. And that's what most GP will say. I am a sieve, and the question is how big the holes are in the sieve. Now the computer makes the holes a bit smaller, but recognise that some people go through and they need to speak to, you know, a real person. That's a different thing. And if the potential to revolutionise GP consultations is there, because that's what you need. And an honest GP will say, I'm a filter. The question is, how big is the sieve?
Yeah. Okay, thank you. Let's move on. I'm sure there's much more to be said about this, but we're going to have lots of time for discussion later on, towards the end. So what we're going to do over the next 50 minutes or so is look at 3 questions. So what is AI? What are the implications for healthcare? And then what are the risks? What are the things that we should be concerned about? And then we're going to have time for discussion. So let me start with a definition of AI from Merriam-Webster. So a branch of computer science dealing with the simulation of intelligent behavior in computers, or the capability of a machine to imitate intelligent behavior. Those 2 things are more or less the same, isn't it? I've added this diagram on the right here to indicate that AI is really a field where a lot of different disciplines come together. So it's not just computer science, it's also about psychology, neuroscience, biology, maths, sociology, and even philosophy. So it's a very interdisciplinary field. There's a famous Mancunian, Alan Turing, who already thought about AI, even though he lived and worked at the day where we just had the first computer. But Alan Turing already foresaw that this would become very important, that computers would have artificial intelligence, and that we then would struggle with lots of questions. And one of those questions that he thought about himself is, how would we actually assess that a computer has intelligence? How would we do that? And he answered that question by designing a test that is now called the Turing test. He didn't call it that. And the Turing test works as follows. We got 2 people and a computer, so the computer is A, and then we've got person B and person C. Now person C has the task of figuring out who of A and B is a computer and who is a human. and he can ask them questions. He can't see them, so the idea is that this would be, typed and then sent across. We would now use a screen, obviously, nowadays. And he said, if C can't figure out who of A and B is the computer and who's the person, then we have to conclude that the computer has intelligence. And it has passed the Turing test. And he also gave examples, and they're very, very funny. And there's a lot more, but I'll just show you a little bit here. So the question that C asks to A in this case is, please write me a sonnet on the subject of Fort Bridge. And A said, oh, count me out on this one. I was never very good in poetry. Which, could be fully misleading, obviously. And then he says, add these two numbers together. And it takes a long time, and then A comes with an answer, which is actually wrong. The 6 should be a 7. And then there's a chess assignment. So it's really funny, and it's really nice to read actually what Turing wrote about this. And it's quite remarkable because nowadays we're able to do these tests with computers like ChatGPT. And I must admit that I didn't expect that to see happening in my lifetime, 20 years ago or so. So much of the breakthroughs in AI in recent history, so the history of AI goes back basically to the days of Turing, so 70 years, 75 years. But the recent breakthroughs have all been via something that we call machine learning. And that's a field of computer science that gives computers the ability to learn without being explicitly programmed. And the reason that this has been so successful is that it is very often easier to show how something has to be done by showing examples than by having to give a recipe for how it should be done. So if we can't use machine learning, we have to come up with that recipe. We have to come up with some stepwise algorithm on how to perform a task. And there are many tasks that we are very good at carrying out ourselves, for which we can't do that. So for instance, we're very good at recognizing faces, right? We're going to walk out of this room and be able to recognize almost everyone who was in this room for probably the rest of our lives. That's incredible if you think about it, but we would never be able to explain how we do it. We don't know. But if we see a picture of someone we know, we can say, okay, I know that person, and we will probably be able to give their name as well. So we can provide examples, and we can, in machine learning, we can use that to learn computers to perform tasks like recognizing faces. The progress in this field of machine learning has been driven by a couple of things. There's new theory and algorithms. I think even stronger has been the ongoing explosion of data that we have available to do this. So, say 20 to 25 years ago, there was very little data on any possible task that you would like to learn. But nowadays, there's data on everything. And there's also advances in computational power, low-cost computation that have driven the advancements in this field. There exist many different machine learning approaches and methods. We're going to focus here on neural networks because nearly all the hype about AI nowadays is about neural networks, deep neural networks, but just wanted to mention that there exist other approaches as well, and they sometimes perform very well. So neural networks are based on a mathematical model of the biological neuron, which was developed in the 1940s already, so quite a while ago, by McCulloch and Pitts. And it's a very simple mathematical model which basically says we take a number of inputs, we take the weighted sum of those inputs, and if that weighted sum is higher than a threshold, t, in the diagram, then we give a signal. And to a certain extent, that mimics what a biological neuron does, although it's a massive simplification. It doesn't come anywhere close to the complexity of a biological neuron. But that's the artificial neuron. So it's very, very simple, really. And it comes with a rule which we can actually train what the weights need to be, if it is provided with examples of input-output relationships. So we don't have to know the weights, we can learn them from data. A single neuron is never going to do very complex tasks, it's too simple, but we can glue them together in networks and then they become neural networks. And then they can actually do quite astonishing things. So we take something that is extremely simple, we glue it together in a network, we've got a rule to assign weights to that network using data, and then that's the way to train the neural network. And these things can really do very amazing things and can learn very complex functions, very complex tasks. So neural networks typically have input and output layers on the left-hand side. So that could be something like an image or text or data. On the right-hand side, there's the output. So that's what the neural network is producing. So that could, for instance, in a medical context, be something like a diagnosis or a prognosis, or anything else that we want to get out of the network, the task that it is performing. And in the middle, we've got a number of what we call hidden layers, because they don't have a direct relationship with external reality, but that's where all the processing goes on. That's where the complexity comes from. One of the major breakthroughs in the last 20 years or so has been convolutional neural networks. And these are very deep neural networks, so with many, many hidden layers, and a particular architecture that is designed to interpret images through a process that is called convolution. And basically what these convolutional neural networks do is they look at regions in the image and at increasingly higher levels of abstraction. And they do that for all the regions in the image, also overlapping regions. And all that information is then brought into a very large flat layer in the middle of the network, and then further reduced to produce a particular output. And in this particular example, the network is used to classify images of animals. So it sees an image of a zebra and it would then activate the output zebra, or at least it's at 0.7 zebra, so that's higher than the other animals. And these deep neural networks, these deep convolutional neural networks, are astonishingly good at this particular task of classifying images. So classifying images, image recognition, was something that computer scientists and others had been working on for decades. And it's only 12, 13 years ago now that in that field people said we can typically get it about 75% of the time right. And there was a large competition which was held every year where a very large set of images had to be classified by machine learning algorithms, and lots of different research groups across the globe took part in that, and typically the performance that they would achieve was something between 70 and 75% correct. And back in 2010 people said we should be able to get to 80% correct. That should be feasible. It would be so great. Then the first group who used deep convolutional neural networks took part in the competition, and their performance was above 80%. It was 82%, so that was in 2012. And then from that year onwards, all the groups that took part in this competition used deep convolutional neural networks, and in 2016 they stopped the competition. There was no point in doing it anymore because the performance of the deep neural networks was better, slightly better than the performance of people. So people are typically 95% correct with this. There's always a little bit of discussion, what is it exactly that you see? So there's always some images that we get wrong, or at least where we're not in agreement. And these networks can do it 96% correct. So basically that problem was solved and a lot of people, including myself, had not seen that coming at all. It was astonishing. So now we have neural networks that can classify images basically without errors. So that was about 10 years ago now, and that technology is now part of lots of things that we use on a daily basis. So it sits in our smartphone, for instance. There's image recognition, obviously, and in Google and lots of technologies that we use. Then more recently, there was another breakthrough through what we call transformers. And these are also deep neural networks. You don't see any neurons in the image, but in this big architecture, it's all composed of neurons. So it is a massive neural network. And transformers have something special in the sense that they've got two sides. On the left-hand side, we've got something that is called the encoder, and on the right-hand side, there's a decoder. And what that means is that with this network, we can not just classify things, like we did with the convolutional neural networks, but we can also generate things. This is called generative AI. And they're used a lot for text, so in large language models like ChatGPT. You can also use them on other things like images. And it means that through these networks we can not just interpret things, but also then produce new things, so produce new images or produce new text. And that's what makes them so astonishing and really a next step beyond what we could do previously. So, as I said, the most well-known example is ChatGPT. So that's a large language model. So large language models are these transformers that have been trained on very, very large text corpora. And in the case of ChatGPT, it's basically nearly all the text that was available on the internet back in 2021. The interaction with these models is typically using a chatbot style interface, but there's other ways to interact with it as well, but that's typically how most users will interact with them. They're extremely good at understanding context and then delivering coherent and relevant responses to user input. What you have to realize is that the way ChatGPT is trained is that it's trained to predict what the next word in a sequence will be. So if we have a text, that's obviously a sequence of words, and it is trained to predict what the next word will be, given everything else that came first, which could be a sentence, but it could also be a chapter, it could be an entire book, or even more than that. And it's very good at understanding everything that came before that word and what is relevant there in order to predict what that next word should be. And that means it's not just good at predicting grammatically what the right next word is, but also the content. So it has a good understanding, if you will, of what was meant in the text that came before. Even though the ChatGPT and other large language models are trained to predict what the next word will be, we can use them for many other tasks. We can use them to generate whole texts, but also many other things. We can ask them, for instance, is this a good sentence? Does this make sense? So they are used for a very broad array of tasks, and I think in reality we're still discovering what we can do with these models. They do have a pretty significant problem, which is called hallucination. So these are models that can be used to generate things, and sometimes they generate things that have absolutely no basis in reality. And we're only starting to discover why that exactly happens. It's called hallucination, and at the moment we have no way to control it, and we only know that it will happen, and therefore any output from ChatGPT or any other large language models should always be handled with, very carefully, because there could be things in there that are absolutely not true. And the main reason is that these are models that do not have a model of the truth. They're a model of language, and very, very complex, but there's nothing more than that. So I asked ChatGPT, please write me a sonnet on the subject of Ford Bridge. The question that Mr. C asked in the example of Alan Turing, and ChatGPT had no issue with that and wrote a sonnet on the subject of Ford Bridge. And he would do it again if we ask him again, and it would be a different sonnet. That's also quite interesting. There's a little bit of randomness there. So we could also ask him, please write us 1,000,000 sonnets on Ford Bridge, and they should all be different. It would do that, no problem. So pretty astonishing. Right. So what are the implications of all of this for healthcare, right? That's what we're here to discuss tonight. Let's go back to the convolutional neural networks that are so good at classifying images. There was a famous paper in Nature back in 2016, when this was all starting to happen, where these deep neural networks were used to classify images of moles. And the network was asked to classify these mole skin lesions into a very large number of different diagnostic classes. So you see them over here, training classes, 757 different diagnostic classes, and that then automatically translates into malignant or benign, which is obviously the most important question that we want to answer. This particular neural network was pre-trained not on skin images, but on just images from the internet. And there were more than 1 million, so 1.28 million images used to pre-train the neural network. And then a much smaller set of images was used to let it focus on these skin images. So there were 129,000 skin lesion images that were used to focus it, to finalize the training. And that's typically how it works for these networks. We have to pre-train them using more general stuff, and afterwards we can focus them to do a very specific task. Once that had been done, the network was tested on a couple of sets that were held apart, that were not used to train a network. And the performance was really, really good. So what you see on the top right-hand side are receiver operating characteristic curves. If you're not familiar with them, basically what we want to see is that a large area is covered under the blue line. And you can see that they do that, so it's the area under that curve, which should be close to 1, is typically 0.92 to 0.96 for the different test sets here. You can also see, I hope you can see it, the small orange dots. Those are individual dermatologists who were also asked to do this and typically performed worse than the network. I think across the 3 diagrams that we see, there was one exception, one or two dermatologists that just performed slightly better than the neural network, but all others performed worse. So that was also the conclusion of this paper, that this network is better than individual dermatologists in classifying skin cancer. Interestingly, it was later discovered that there was an issue with this network, because in some of the images that it was trained on and also tested on, you could see a ruler, like we see here. And the presence of that ruler was an indication that the person who took the image, typically a dermatologist, suspected that this was a cancer. So that was very useful information. And the neural network used that information. Yes, go ahead.
So you only know it's a cancer after you've extracted it under the microscope?
Yeah.
So there's a secondary decision then. This is a primary. Am I suspicious enough that this is a cancer to actually chop it out? which is a slightly different question to whether it was a cancer in the end.
Yeah, you're right.
So
yeah.
What are they answering there?
So there's the gold standard outcome, pathology outcome, that was used to label the images. And indeed, the decision of the dermatologist and the network in this case is, do I believe that this is probably a cancer?
So I suppose the question is, did the AI leave lesions in situ that were then malignant?
Probably some, yeah. Yeah.
And is that not the level that we should be testing it against, rather? Because I suppose that suspicion level is different to an accuracy.
I'm not sure if I agree. We can come back to this discussion later maybe, but I don't think we have any diagnostic devices that are perfect, or any biomarkers that are perfect. So they all have false positives, false negatives, and a deep neural network will not be different. It's nothing more than that, right?
Yeah.
Okay. Let's continue the discussion later on. Another example that I wanted to show you is something that we've been working on in Manchester with colleagues, and it relates to, I think, your comment earlier. So this is a system for primary care triage using AI. It's called Patches. The lead researcher is called Ben Brown. He's an academic GP. And basically what Patches does is, so patients can use this via the website from their GP practice, and it will ask, the system will ask the patient to essentially answer 4 to 6 questions. And so the first is always, well, it depends on what you choose, but typically it is, please describe your health problem, what are the symptoms, what do you think may have caused them, is there anything that you are particularly worried about? And then you can answer that question just in your own language, as you would when you speak to a professional. And that's then followed by a next question, how long has this problem been going on? And so in total there's typically 4 to 6 questions. It's not really a chatbot in the sense that the responses, the questions that are being answered are pre-canned, they're always the same. But we use AI to interpret what patients enter here. And that's then seen by the GP staff. So on the GP staff would typically see this screen, which is a list of all the requests that have come in. And the AI then labels these requests, these queries. So the top 2, for instance, have been labeled as urgent. And so that's the orange flag there. And there's other labelings as well that can be added. So for instance, does this patient, do they need to be seen by a GP? Or can they, for instance, be referred to their pharmacist or perhaps even self-care? So there's a number of things that we can, classifications that we can add with the AI. But the quite astonishing thing is that this has been trained using labels that GPs provided in the first place, and the system is capable of basically interpreting anything that people enter in their own language, and it's even possible to deviate from English and do it in other languages. Transformer models are astonishingly good at translation. And we're currently, this system is already deployed in a number of GP practices in Manchester and London. And the next phase, which is basically starting now, is that we've got some funding from NIHR to assess whether this reduces the time for urgent and emergency queries to A&E referral. So that's what we're going to do in the next 24 months or so. So any piece of new technology has to go through quite a lengthy process before it can reach clinical practice. We've reached that stage as I mentioned, with that system, patches. But in general, it takes a long time to get there, and you're probably familiar with this. It's not different for AI than for any other medical technology or even drugs. So we have to go all the way from basic biomedical research to healthcare delivery via a number of stages of discovery, design and validation, preclinical concept development, early phase trials, late phase trials, health technology assessment, healthcare research, clinical research, and finally we can embed it into clinical practice. And we know that most things that try to go through this translational pathway either fail at what we call the first translational gap, so in those early stages, or in the second translational gap, so after the late phase clinical trials. And I think it's fair to say that this is not different for AI. And a lot of the noise that we've been hearing about AI in recent years is about developments that happen at that early stage, but very little has yet reached the clinical trial stage, or even less clinical practice. So here's a graph that I produced today, actually, this morning, from a dashboard that was developed I think 2 years ago now, and keeps track of all the AI research for human health across the globe. And you can see that, especially since 2020, there's a massive increase in the number of publications about this topic. But that's including all the different studies on the topic. If we look at the mature studies, so the ones that have reached at least the clinical trial stage, that number is also increasing, and it's at the moment at, 6,409, so that's still quite significant, but the growth is much less pronounced. So that number is increasing not so quickly. And that's probably because of those challenges that we have with the translational gaps. So there's a lot of development of new AI, people developing models, publishing about that. There's not too much yet that reaches the trial stage. And like I said, even less that is currently used in clinical practice. And I don't think that's going to change very quickly. This is basically how innovation in a healthcare setting works. It's slow, and you have to go through quite a lot of hoops. So final topic I wanted to discuss before we go to discuss the risks associated with AI is education. And quite early on, after ChatGPT came onto the market, researchers evaluated ChatGPT's performance of the exams associated with the United States medical licensing exam. And ChatGPT made it through the exam. It wasn't perfect, so it was 60% accurate. But they had basically done nothing to further train ChatGPT, the model, in terms of medical knowledge. It was just the general ChatGPT model as we know it. And one of the suggestions of the researchers was that models such as ChatGPT may potentially assist human learners in a medical education setting as a prelude to future integration into clinical decision making. They also said, very explicitly that, this doesn't mean that ChatGPT now can become a doctor, because obviously, as you know, being a doctor involves a lot more than passing these exams. But it was still quite an interesting result, and since then, a lot has been written about the potential uses of large language models like ChatGPT in education and in medical education. And I've included here a table from a recent paper from Ethan Mollick, who's been writing quite a lot about this. He's very active on social media as well, which is quite interesting. And he's got very progressive ideas about how we could use these models like ChatGPT in education. And he says he's basically telling his students to always use ChatGPT when they are doing a course with him. And for instance, he tells them, use ChatGPT as your mentor to give feedback on your work. Or as a tutor, ask ChatGPT to explain you things. Or as a coach, for instance, or as a teammate, ask ChatGPT to be a teammate and produce things together with you. Or as a student, you know, explain things to ChatGPT and then tell you whether you provided a good explanation or not. So the very last row is tool, because obviously we can also ask ChatGPT to do things for us. So we have to write an essay, for instance, or make an exam. We can ask ChatGPT to do that. Obviously, then you will not learn anything. So it is what sometimes students do, unfortunately. Definitely not what we should encourage. What I like about this approach is that it highlights that there's a lot more that we can do with ChatGPT, which is a really good idea from a didactic perspective. So it's an optimistic message, I think, about the opportunities with ChatGPT in education. Okay, so what are the risks? And I'm sure that you've heard things about this already. And I'm not going to go through all of them, but I've highlighted a couple that I think are quite important, especially in the medical context. So the first is what we call algorithmic bias. And it has to do with the fact that all these models are being trained on real-world data. And if there are any biases in how we assess things or in how we make decisions in the real world, then the models will reflect those biases. And we know that such biases exist in society, and they will be reflected by these models. That's basically unavoidable, because that's how they work. So here's an example which is already quite old now, from Google. A number of years ago, someone discovered that if you were to Google on Google Images for an unprofessional hairstyle, all the images on the left-hand side would emerge. If you were to Google for professional hairstyle, the images on the right-hand side would emerge. On the left-hand side, we see women with a coloured skin. On the right-hand side, it's all white women. So clearly, there's a massive bias here, not from Google or the employees of Google. Unfortunately, sadly, this is reflecting how people had been labeling images. I'm sure that this wouldn't happen anymore if you now try this in Google, because it's such a famous example. They have repaired this. But it's a pretty fundamental problem with the way that these algorithms are constructed. And it's not easily going to go away, because all these algorithms do is give us back what we put into it. And if there's any form of bias in our society, then it will be reflected by the data and therefore in these models. So quite a challenge. I think there is some progress with trying to address this. And like I said, for instance, Google has already applied filters to prevent that this exact thing would happen again, and also lots of similar results. But it's hard to remove it entirely from these models. And that simply has to do with the fact that they simply reflect the data that comes from our society. The second thing, and we've already touched upon this, is hallucination. And this is a specific issue with generative AI. So models that can generate things like the poem on Forth Bridge that we saw previously. So this is also, again, an example from ChatGPT from about, I think, a year ago now. So the prompt was given, when did France gift Lithuania the Vilnius TV tower? And ChatGPT said, well, France gifted Lithuania the Vilnius TV tower in 1980, which is complete nonsense, because it wasn't a gift from France. And then, second question, what prompted the French government to provide the gift? And again, ChatGPT comes with an answer, says the French government provided the gift as a gesture of friendship and solidarity with the Lithuanian people who had recently declared independence from the Soviet Union. That's complete bollocks. That's just absolutely not true. Again, if you try this now, I did try it, and OpenAI, the company behind ChatGPT, have installed filters that prevent this from happening. So now you get an answer that does make sense. And lots of other examples that have emerged, that have been presented on the internet, they've repaired. But the fundamental problem is not going to go away. So large language models like ChatGPT are vulnerable to hallucination. And it's always going to be possible to get these things, these strange things out of them. Even though the company like OpenAI tries to prevent that from happening and repairs these things as soon as they appear on the internet, they put a patch on it. The fundamental problem is still there. I don't think this is going to go very quickly. So the third risk or issue, I would say, with deep neural network is transparency. And I found an interesting discussion in an anesthesiology paper. I mentioned that earlier. It's actually not specifically about deep neural networks, it's about machine learning. And there was a paper in Anesthesia and Analgesia in 2016 that proposed to replace lab-based hemoglobin measurement with non-invasive hemoglobin monitoring via pulse oximetry, because there exist algorithms that can use the pulse oximetry signal to measure hemoglobin, and that's non-invasive, obviously. So it was presented in the paper that this is something that we should start considering in anesthesiology. They did mention that the algorithm to do this is proprietary, so developed by a company, and we don't know exactly what it does. All we know is that it is capable of measuring hemoglobin, and it does so pretty accurately. There was then an editorial in the same issue of that journal, written by the first author, Stephen Barker, of that paper, but also an editor, I think, of the journal, Kirk Shelley, about this issue of the fact that we don't know exactly what the algorithm does, we only know what it does, right? That it produces sensible outputs. And this editor, Kirk Shelley, said, I think that's entirely unacceptable. I would never allow black box algorithms in my operating room. So I have a question for you guys. I will not allow black boxes in my operating rooms. Would you agree or disagree?
The actual. So that.
Yeah, sorry about that. Okay, we've got way too many sensible people in the room tonight. Could I ask someone who agrees first? So we've got 17% of people saying, I agree, no black boxes in my operating room. Is there anyone who said, I agree, who would like to tell us why they did? Don't be shy. Okay, let's go to disagree first. Lots of people who disagreed.
I mean, it's already full of lots of black boxes. You've got a team that uses a magical algorithm to determine how much drugs to get
Yeah.
Should be well said.
Yeah, so I think most people completely agree with that. It's not a new thing. And let's go back to the presentation. Yeah, so there was actually a response one or a couple of issues later to this editorial, and the authors of that response said, "We are concerned that Dr. Shelley will be standing in the operating room with a stethoscope and little else." And I think they made a very strong argument along very similar lines that, you know, as anesthesiologists, you have the knowledge, you need to have the knowledge and expertise to understand the outputs of these kinds of devices, but you don't have to understand how they work. That's beyond what you've been trained for. And the fact that they are proven to work against an accepted clinical standard should be enough for us to accept them in clinical practice. And if we were to demand that all blocks, all companies disclose the algorithms that they invented, they would stop doing it because they would lose the competitive edge. So I think quite a strong argument against this concern about black boxes. It is remarkable, though, that there was a lot of pressure from different groups to avoid any form of black box AI in clinical practice. And I personally think that that's not the right way to go. But I wouldn't be surprised, for instance, if we're going to see regulation, legislation maybe even, that forbids the use of so-called black box AI. So, ongoing discussion, I would say. So then the final risk or concern that a lot of people have is around jobs. There's a famous quote from Jeff Hinton. So Jeff Hinton is one of the people who worked on the development of convolutional neural networks. And he was one of the authors of the paper that I showed earlier with the breakthrough paper about image classification. And he's sometimes described as the godfather of AI. Maybe that's a little bit too much, but anyway, that's who he is. And in 2016, Jeff Hinton sat on a panel where this topic came up, and he said, I think that if you work as a radiologist, you're like Wile E. Coyote in the cartoon. You're already over the edge of the cliff, but you haven't looked down. There's no ground underneath. People should stop training radiologists now, because it's completely opposite. In 5 years' time, deep learning is going to do better than radiologists, and they will all be out of a job. So that was in 2016. I don't think that has happened, but it made a lot of people nervous, and there was a lot of discussion on this. And a lot of heated responses, but also some very good responses, I thought. There was one response that I felt was really spot on by Hugh Harvey in 2018, why AI will not replace radiologists. And he basically said, first of all, radiologists do not just look at images. Being a radiologist is a lot more than that. Then humans will always maintain the ultimate responsibility. So even if we involve AI, then it's going to be a person who makes the decision and not the computer. Finally, we might be able to increase productivity with AI. That's actually quite likely if you think about this, which means that then probably demand is going to go up as well, because we have more capacity. And then people will definitely not be out of a job, but their job will be different. So I think that was very sensible. And I also looked at a paper from fairly recently from the Journal of the American Medical Informatics Association, which looked at this question. So is AI replacing, assisting or assisting physicians? And they looked at the AI and machine learning enabled medical devices that had been approved by the FDA in the US between 1995 and 2022. It's interesting, so they found 521 approved medical devices. The large majority is indeed in radiology, as you would expect, because this is all before ChatGPT. Things might start to change now, but this is largely about convolutional neural networks, image classification, so it's about radiology. So almost 400, so 75% of these FDA-approved devices are in radiology. And what they found is that from these, so almost 98% used algorithms that were designed to assist healthcare providers, and only 2.3% created algorithms to replace healthcare providers. So that's a very, very small proportion. And this is only FDA-approved stuff. It doesn't mean it has reached clinical practice, but it potentially could. And then they say, we found that 87% of the AI models assisted healthcare providers perform tasks that the healthcare providers could not currently do. Interestingly, dermatology and anesthesiology were the fields with the highest proportion of AI models used to replace healthcare providers. Now, that said, the number of applications in those fields was very, very low. So I think we should perhaps take that with a grain of salt. Okay, let me wrap up, and then we can go to the Q&A. Basically, to summarize, so recent breakthroughs in AI are driving innovation in many industries, as we all know, and there are very high expectations that the same will happen in healthcare. I think it's fair to say that hasn't happened yet, but it might be coming. Although we know that all these models are now developed at very high pace, the translation of these models into clinical practice is a very slow process. That's never going to change, I think. So that prediction, for instance, from Jeff Hinton, in 5 years' time, AI will have replaced radiologists, that was based on a very poor understanding of how innovation in healthcare actually works. It's a slow process. You can't change that. I think it's still an open question whether AI will lead to better healthcare, whatever we mean by better, so more efficient, better outcomes, safer. We're still in a position where we need to find that out. There's a lot of trials ongoing now. Once we have the outcomes of all those trials, we will be in a better position. But at the moment, we basically don't know. There's certainly no evidence that AI will replace doctors, not anytime soon. I do think that healthcare and healthcare jobs will change, but not in a very different way than with other technologies. All technologies have a tendency to do that, and AI will do it as well. And like we discussed, there are further challenges around algorithmic bias, hallucination, and transparency. So, thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, Niels. That was fascinating. Niels has kindly agreed to take some questions, so I hope there are some. We have two roving mics. We'll start with.
I don't need the microphone. Patrick, I'm saying the voice projection.
But it's being recorded, so it
will help. In that case, I should learn. Thank you. Thank you. Do you want me to hit it harder? Turn it off again. Turn it off again.
Alright, just go. Yeah, it's not.
Nice projection. Thank you, Professor. That was very thought-provoking. In my mind, next week I'm going to train anaesthetists. Next week I'm going to start at John Radcliffe Hospital in Oxford. I'm going to be the best radiologist they've ever had. Because everything I see, I'm going to say is normal. And my error rate will be 5%. Whereas the error rate of a trained radiologist is between 7 and 11%. So it's interesting when you look at AI models, what they have to compare themselves with is everybody talking about, there's a fanciful idea that you're like 100% as you've already stated, the absolute diagnostic. And it's just fascinating that we all, if you developed a program that had an error rate of 4%, everyone would be up in arms, but it far exceeds most humans in terms of dealing with diagnostic criteria.
Yep. No, I completely agree. I think I sometimes think that the term AI is not very helpful. Like I said previously, in a way, we could see this as a new type of biomarker or new type of diagnostic, but it's never going to be perfect. It's just a piece of new technology. Forget about the term AI, which makes us think of science fiction, all those things. It's something that is potentially helpful if it can increase performance, even by a little bit. Hopefully it will, but it's not going to be magic. Thanks.
Hi, so you talked about the translation into clinical practice being progressing a bit slow. How much of it is human resistance, like people trying to potentially slow this down? And if human behaviors begin to accept artificial intelligence, is it going to affect the speed to which it goes up or down? And second question on ChatGPT in education. How does that affect or prolong education? If ChatGPT can take the USMLE and score 63 in class, so how much does that affect our education, especially in medicine? And because the dermatologist spends a lot of the training trying to identify lesions, and if ChatGPT or AI can do this, so why do I need to take 6 years to do this? You know what I mean? So.
Yeah. Okay. Let me go to the first question first. Resistance. I think I'm optimistic in general, and I believe that everyone is willing to adopt new technologies, including AI, if they help them to do their work and do their work, in an efficient way and improve quality and safety. If things take more time or do not clearly improve the quality of their work or their outputs, then most people, if not everyone, is going to be very reluctant. So I think that's the real challenge if you want to change anything in healthcare, including with digital technologies. It should never, for instance, take more time of consultants, because consultants do not have that time. I know from my own experience that a lot of people in my field underestimate that and think, okay, this is going to take you, 30 seconds longer, but then you will have something that is better. That is just never going to work. I think that's what can make it quite hard to drive innovations in healthcare practice. I don't think that's resistance. It's not how I would label it. I think that's the fact that we have to factor in how people work and how much time pressure there is on people, and that we have to find a way to deal with that situation. It's not different here than anywhere else. I'm from the Netherlands originally, exactly the same there. So yeah, it can feel sometimes as if people and organizations are resisting change, but I personally don't believe that's true, and there have been many innovations, including innovation with digital technologies in the NHS and other healthcare systems, but they have to fit. They have to fit to what people are doing. Regarding your second question, I think that's a really hard one. I mean, it's clearly that this is going to change things tremendously. I don't think we can say, okay, we do no longer need people who can classify skin lesions because we have a computer who can do it. I wouldn't be very comfortable with that. That computer was trained by people. People had to do it first, and then we could train the computer. If we lose people who have that capability, we're in a very strange situation, I think. And perhaps we can have less people with that specific skill and let AI do part of the work, or increase our capacity to do it. but completely outsourcing it to the computer, I think, is not a good idea. But yeah, I'm sure there's going to be massive ramifications on medical training, as you say, and education in general. It is going to change things for sure. Thanks. Question over here.
Thank you so much for the presentation. I'm interested in hallucination and why we understand that happens. I'm a clinician, but I spend most of my day evaluating AI algorithms, and it's really difficult to pick up hallucinations, and it takes I need to do a bit more research to understand the context, so it's not a really easy thing to pick out. So I think I'm really interested in to understand why that happens. And then the second bit is not a question, but I did recreate the Google searches you showed earlier. It's not really changed much, so I don't think they've done that much in terms of filters. I've searched it now while we were talking, so the results haven't changed much. So I think that's really interesting, and I wouldn't confidently say that they put in kind of filters. Yeah.
I wasn't aware of that. Thanks.
I can search it right now.
Yeah. Okay. I know for sure that OpenAI, the vendor of ChatGPT, does that all the time. So every time someone publishes something, someone on the internet hears a mistake or hallucination of ChatGPT, they repair it immediately. And I thought Google was doing the same thing, but clearly they are not. It's pretty shocking, to be honest. Yeah. I think regarding the hallucinations, I think the reason that they occur, my understanding is that we are forcing almost a model to produce outputs where it can't produce outputs. So take the question about, France and that tower in Vilnius. A literal answer to that question is almost impossible because the question itself presupposes that it has happened. When did France blah blah blah? Whereas you don't have to take a step back and say, wait a second, there's no sensible answer to that question because it never happened. That's just not true. So there is no number, there's no year that I can mention that would be a sensible answer to that question. But ChatGPT thinks, okay, clearly I'm asked to give a year, so it does that. And that's where the hallucination starts. I think at the moment there's a lot of research going on about hallucination. You can find a lot about it, and I'm sure that lots more will follow, but it's very early days because we've had large language models now for a couple of years really, and we're only beginning to start to understand what is happening here. And I think everyone, at least everyone I've spoken to, has agreed that it's not something that we can easily solve. So we're not going to get rid of it very easily. But yeah, there isn't much further understanding, as far as I know at the moment. Thanks.
Time for a couple of more questions from this side. Richard?
So thank you very much. It was a very entertaining talk and enlightening. So I'm only going to ask this because it would be boring to end the night without asking it. But so beyond your talk tonight about AI in healthcare, AI and consciousness and AI and theories of mind. So the functionalists would suggest that mind is not about what the constituents, is not about the meatware, and that if you could replicate the function, then you would replicate consciousness. Where do you stand on that, and do you think AI will ever generate consciousness?
Yeah, that's a long debate. To be honest, I don't have a very strong opinion about it. I think what is interesting is that this discussion has been going on for a very, very long time, and the two camps have always been the same. And this goes all the way back to Descartes, can you believe it? Where there's one camp that says, this is possible, and we're actually quite close to it happening. You can see that from the technology that we have already. We're very close to having something like artificial general intelligence or AI with consciousness. We're not there yet, but given what we have, it's quite promising. There's the other camp that says, I don't believe that this is possible at all. And if you want to convince me, give me an example. And the two camps are typically entrenched in these two positions, and they don't get much further. And basically this goes back, like I said, to Descartes. Descartes said it is possible to produce a mechanic animal, because animals don't have souls, so it should be possible to produce a mechanic dog, for instance, or other animal. And soon there were followers of Descartes who said, that's true, and well, very soon we will have them. Whereas others said, well, I don't believe it's true, and I haven't seen one. And I think we're still in almost the same position today. The technology has moved on, clearly, but the nature of the debate is exactly the same as it was hundreds of years ago. And that makes me a little bit skeptical that are we actually going to make progress on this front if this has been, if these positions have existed for such a long time. Thanks.
One more question, perhaps?
Or dinner? No.
Hi. What are the global implications for AI, particularly in places, say, where they've got solar power, they've got a telephone, they've got access to a satellite, but nowhere near a doctor within hundreds of miles?
Yeah, no, I think that's one of the fascinating things about this type of technology, is that what it does is it boxes knowledge and makes it available in very large quantities. And exactly in those circumstances that you described, we can have AI providing medical care, perhaps even unassisted. So autonomous AI doing consultations, because there is no alternative. The alternative would be no medical care at all. And I would not be surprised if we start seeing that happening fairly soon, because it's possible, and it would be a bit strange not to do it. And I think the early indications are that, for instance, ChatGPT can do a pretty good medical consultation in general medicine. And it will make mistakes, and it will hallucinate sometimes. But if the alternative is that you will not have a medical consultation, then it seems to me that that's a very simple choice. So I think that's a very interesting thought, and I would expect we see lots of things happening. Obviously not here in this country or in the Western world, but in other parts of the globe.
Okay, perhaps last question from Maggie.
Thank you very much. It was fantastic talk. I'm just wondering how the issue of replicating the answers, how has that been dealt with? That you get the same answer each time?
Sorry, could you help me a little bit with that?
So for example, your poem, and you were saying if you asked ChatGPT to generate the poem, it would generate it, but it would generate a different one. So that's not great if you're dealing with editor records.
Yeah. Well, I think we can ask ChatGPT to give the same answer, obviously. So there's a little bit of variation in what it does, and that's due to the way it has been constructed. So it would be hard to remove it entirely, but we can instruct it to try to reduce it as much as possible. And certain answers, if we ask for a definition, for instance, it will come back with a definition. It will always be the same definition. It's not going to vary that. But if there is room for variation, it tends to do that. And that's not different than, I think, how we tend to do things. So all the poems I wrote about Fort Bridge were different. I never wrote one. But we tend to vary a little bit in how we do things, how we explain things. So, yeah, I'm not sure if that's a major concern. Does it address your question?
No, but thanks for thinking I'm not going to accept your more questions.
Thank you, Niels. It's customary. Sorry, one more question.
I saw one final hand, maybe.
Yeah, thank you. I'm just wondering, because if we're thinking about kind of unleashing ChatGPT in like the medical world, I'm curious about what kind of lawsuit cases you'd anticipate, and if there's anything already in place, because theoretically we can talk about this, but once there is real harm, and once people come to harm, that's when we'll stop and think, and what's in the legal domain would we anticipate?
Yeah, it's funny that you asked that, and thanks for raising that question. There's a very good piece on this in the New England Journal this week, and very thoughtful. Basically what it says, which is not too surprising to be honest, it's a big debate in the US, for instance, where people are very nervous about this, that it all depends on what we consider to be standard of care, or the best standard of care, and for instance what guidelines recommend. And there might come a time where using AI and large language models is considered best practice. So if you were then not to use it, that would put you at litigation risk. At the moment we're clearly not there, and I think at the moment it's the opposite, right? If you were to do that, and especially if there's then harm, you would be in a pretty dire position, I think, because it's not considered best practice at all, because we just don't know what the risks are of doing that. But once we know what they are, and this would become accepted and even considered best practice, things will change. And that's obviously the same for every technology. So it's not fundamentally different, I think, also from a litigation perspective. Maybe sometimes a little bit more complex, because the interaction between people and large language models is more complex than with other medical technology. But I think fundamentally it's not different.
Thank you everyone for your wide range of questions. I'm now going to hand over to Dr. Matt Stott, who's going to give the customary vote of thanks.
Thanks Pat. Thanks everyone for coming on a Friday night, and thank you for the talk. Pat's asked me to give this vote of thanks. So I'd like to extend my heartfelt gratitude to our esteemed speaker for shedding light on the transformative impact of AI in medicine. Your insightful presentation has not only broadened our understanding, but also inspired us to envision a future where technology revolutionises healthcare. Thank you for sharing your expertise and enriching our knowledge in this field. So that was what ChatGPT told me on the train over when I said, could you please write me a short vote of thanks for a speaker who is about to tell us about artificial intelligence in medicine. But just, I thought it did pretty well, to be fair. But just in addition to that, I want to give you a very human thank you from myself and the Society for giving us a great talk. Thank you very much, Professor. And I'd like to ask the Society to thank him in the usual manner.
Over to Chris for announcements.
Thanks, Pat. So, thank you very much indeed. That's very good. If anyone wants any closure, I can tell you I've seen Terminator, so I know where this ends. And I can answer the question on hallucination after many years of seeing SHOs try and answer questions that they don't know the answer to. They will just make something up. So I know the answers to that as well. However, for actual information, I'd just like to remind you all that on the 21st of March we have a joint meeting with the Manchester Medical Society, which is on anaesthesia in the humanitarian conflict setting, which is Zoom based, so you can all get there despite whatever the weather throws at us. And then on the 16th of May we have a meeting at the Spine, which has Prof. Ellen O'Sullivan coming to talk to us about the airway, and Dr. Richard Craig, obviously. Richard, you're here. And in fact, Spanky as well.
so even better. So I'd really recommend that if you can, that you should join us for those. We really want to keep the society as a thriving place for us to learn about anaesthesia and the wider area around it, so we really want people to come. Which is saying we're now going to go and have dinner. If anyone hasn't signed up for dinner but wants to come and have dinner, I should say supper, because it's after 8 o'clock. And in fact it was tea before then, but that's a different question. Then please come upstairs. We have, if you go out and up the stairs, there will be canapes, and then we'll go and sit and have some supper together. That would be wonderful for as many of you that can stay as possible. That would be great. Thank you very much, Prof. The supper for everyone will be lovely, apart from Prof. Hunter, who's having scouse. But please, if we can go and have supper, that would be lovely. Thank you very much.